This is Dr. Dale Matchek from Northwood University. Welcome to the 2020 Northwood University Freedom Seminar. It's an unusual format because this is an unusual year, and I don't need to tell all of you how disruptive it has been. But we are not going to let that stop us from doing what the Northwood University Freedom Seminar is designed to do. And that is to provide an intellectually stimulating environment for our students, friends, and alumni to discuss the way in which the Northwood idea applies to current issues of the day. And of course, the current issue for this year is the COVID-19 virus. And we're going to be examining political, economic, and ethical issues related to this incredible event. So economic issues are everywhere. Many of us have been affected by this. We're no longer allowed to work, or we're working from home. Many people have seen their business disrupted, and government has gone into debt trying to stimulate the economy. It's hard to do when people are out of work. So one of the issues is there a public policy or an appropriate public policy to keep the economy going during a time like this, and to make sure that when things get back to normal, that people can get back to work. Speaking of work, that's one of the ethical issues about this virus. People want to make a living. People want to open. People want to get back to work. It's important for their mental health as well as economics of it. And so how do we cope with the loss of work, which connects us to others in society and enables us to be productive members of our community? And there's obviously political issues as well. And we're going to be talking about all of that in a series of presentations this weekend, put together by some fine people that we brought together for this purpose from around the country, and a few people from right here at Northwood University as well. So I want to mention before we get started that we owe a debt to the Northwood University McNair Center, who is sponsoring this event. The Northwood University McNair Center for the Advancement of Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship is an important feature associated with Northwood University to promote the Northwood idea, and this is one of the ways in which they're doing that. So thank them very much. And now I want to introduce our first speaker of the day. So I'm pleased to have with us this morning Dr. Ann Rathbone Bradley. Dr. Bradley will be speaking on the topic of creativity will conquer COVID-19. Dr. Bradley is going to be speaking about the ways in which entrepreneurship and the private sector has been and will continue to be the driving force beyond getting things back to normal. And so I want you to know a little bit about Dr. Bradley before we start. First of all, she is the George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education and the Academic Director at the Fund for American Studies. She's a professor of economics at the Institute for World Politics, Grove City College. Before this, she was the Vice President of Economic Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. And she's the author of several books, including Counting the Cost, Christian Perspectives on Capitalism, Be Fruitful and Multiply, Why Economics is Necessary for Making God-Pleasing Decisions. She was the Associate Director for the program in Economics, Politics, and Law at the James M. Buchanan Center at George Mason University, where she received her PhD in economics in 2006. So we are very glad that she was able to join us today. And before she begins her presentation, we are going to show you a video produced by the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and that will serve as an introduction to her talk today. Thank you, and enjoy.
Our lives are not divided into two halves, with one part being sacred and another part secular. Worship is not reserved only for Sunday morning, but for Monday morning as well. Every time we get out of bed and ready ourselves for the day. Every time we labor at a task, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Every moment is a gift. Every moment belongs to the one who gave us that moment. There is a way that leads a man to flourish. It is freedom. The freedom to discover his true potential, to keep the fruits of his labor, to find fulfillment in his work. These freedoms are the right of every person because they come woven into the God-given dignity of every person. Where they exist, societies and people flourish. Where they are absent, there is only poverty. These freedoms must be championed, for this is God's design for us, for the good of all He has created.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm so thrilled that I was invited, and I'm sad that we can't be together in person, but I'm so grateful, and I know you are as well, that we have this technology that allows us to be together until we can be in the same room together again. So for now, this is how we're going to proceed, and I actually think that it's going to work quite well. So welcome this morning. As Dale mentioned, I'm an economist by training. I'm a Christian, and we wanted to start off with this video to really show you or provide a perspective of the Judeo-Christian foundations of how we think about the role and the purpose of human beings. And that is so important as we think about COVID. So I'm really going to start with some first principles, but pretty quickly I'm going to try to develop the case that creativity, which is part of who we are, it's intrinsic to our design, to our nature, is really what's going to solve the problems that COVID has created. And I don't think that this is talked about often enough. When we watch the news, when we read Twitter and blog posts and things like this, I'm not sure that we're hearing enough of that message. And I think that's going to be not only confusing to many people, but I think that it distorts the reality of what we need to do and what we can do. So I want to kind of, like I said, just go back quickly to scripture, and you saw references to this in the video. But the idea here that I think is really important, again, from the foundation of Judeo-Christian theology, is that we are created to work. And I would add into that this is a pre-fall ordinance. So work is not a punishment that comes after the fall, but rather work and kind of our created design we see in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. So I just want to share this verse with you, Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to work it and to care for it. That's a really important verse. I think that it has these 2 phrases that we need to talk about for a moment. To take care of something means to preserve it, to protect it, to ensure that it doesn't get destroyed or pillaged or plundered. But that's not all we're asked to do. So in other words, after we read the creation story in Genesis 1, God doesn't follow up kind of with the 7-day creation story by telling us, okay, now don't touch anything. Make sure, everything remains just as it is. In fact, we are to work it. And the word in Hebrew is abad. And abad is translated as to serve. I think that's so important because right off the bat in Christian theology, you see what our marching orders are. We are here to work it and to protect it. So we need to make sure that the earth and its resources and each other are not destroyed, but we are to change and to cultivate and to innovate. And we do this through the work of our hands. And so that's really our purpose. And, we have a short time here together, but I could truly talk about this slide alone, I think, for a long, period of time, the entire time that we have. So I'm happy to field questions as we come back to this later, but I think this is really important because it tells us who we are, what we're supposed to do. And I think that fits right into where we find ourselves now in the midst of a disaster. But before we get to that, understanding this part of our human nature and this part of God's design for us, then I think that we have to go right from that to kind of the begging question, which is, okay, if this is true, that God has created us in this way, then what kind of society do we need so that we can live socially among each other? That's another idea that comes out of Scripture. You see it in the Trinity. You see it in Genesis 1, where we're made in the image of God, in the likeness of God. And the video also referred to human dignity. So that view is a special view of human nature. Human beings are not a curse on the planet, not a drain on the planet, or on each other for that matter, but rather we're created to be here, and we're social, and we have dignity. So all those things become really important. The rush to protect the dignity of life and the dignity of the family and the dignity of community is part of what we're supposed to do. And so from these kind of basic tenets of Christian theology, we get an understanding, or we start to get an understanding, I think, of, what type of society do we need to live in? And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. I think that there's 3 spheres of society generally. Again, this is kind of some basic political economy, but really important for the question that I've been asked to talk about today, which is what is the role of human entrepreneurship and human creativity in solving the crisis that we find ourselves in? So generally, there are kind of 3 sectors of society broadly that we can think about. There's market activity, there's the activity of civil society, and there's the activity of the state or the arena of the state. And these are all aspects of social life. Remember, we don't live in isolation, and we were not made to live in isolation. We were made to come together. Markets work differently than the state, and that works differently than civil society. What's unique about the market sphere is that it uses prices and property rights and profits and losses to allocate scarce resources. The other 2 spheres, civil society and the state, while important in their own roles, they do not use profit and loss and prices to allocate scarce resources. So when we think about civil society, we think about churches, we think about charities, we think about community groups, all those types of organizations that really motivate people, bring people together in community, and they're essential for a flourishing, thriving world. And the robustness of the civil sphere is very important. And I think we can see parts of that in the response to COVID. I think the market is really important in terms of our response to COVID. And I think other people are going to talk more maybe in other lectures about the role of the state, but certainly the state is the arena in which hopefully, right, we protect property rights through the rule of law. We protect the functioning of the market. We protect the rights of individuals. Now, kind of the big questions in political economy are what should the state do and what should the market do? And of course, those are still hotly contested questions. And I think in the face of a pandemic, they become more hotly contested. But what I would urge us to think about today is that in a crisis, that's, the most important time to go back to your principles. It's the most important time to not forget how societies function, which is kind of why I'm starting here with the fundamentals and the basics. Because if we forget those, And we live, currently in a state of fear and uncertainty. We don't know what the future holds. I think that we can run to the wrong sector for solutions to our problems. And we need to make sure we're running to the sectors for certain things that they are best suited to solve. And of course, that's really what economics is about, right? Economics is about solving decisions or making decisions about the best allocation of scarce resources in the moment. And it's about doing that when we don't have all the individual knowledge to be able to do that. And so for economists, the reason that we prefer generally markets for resource allocation is because they use these three Ps. Prices, property rights, and profits and losses. And I would say to you, the most really fundamental of the three Ps are property rights. If you don't have exchangeable, divisible, transferable property rights, it's very hard to have, scaled up trade. Now, don't get me wrong, people trade everywhere all day long. Even the poorest countries, on the planet today, people are trading. But without well-defined property rights, that trade is difficult. It's not always transparent. It's not always repeatable. So people don't have predictability in their lives. So property rights, I think, if you think of this as kind of a three-legged stool, I would say property rights are essential, the most essential leg. From that, you get the emergence of prices and you get the emergence of profits and losses. And that's really important because profits and losses direct entrepreneurs to what consumers need and want. Now, why is this important in a crisis? Because in a crisis, like the one we're living through right now, people's needs changed almost overnight, right? They changed almost overnight. It's true. Lessons in all of economics is that we live in a world of scarcity, and so we always have to make trade-offs. We always have to make choices. There is, as economists say, no free lunch. I'll say it again, really important to remember those key principles in a crisis. Because as we think about things like how are we going to get more toilet paper, how are we going to get more hand sanitizer, and those are probably not as important questions as how are we going to get a vaccine right now, and how are we going to get it as fast as possible? How are we going to get better tests? How are we going to deliver those tests in a fast way? So as you can see, what a crisis does, and in this case with COVID, almost overnight, in a very short time period, all of the sudden, consumers need different things than they did before the crisis. And so entrepreneurs have to figure out not only what the precise nature of those needs are, but how to fill them as best as possible. So there's a great little essay that was published years and years ago, I believe in 1954, by Leonard Read, and it's called I, Pencil. If you're an economics student, you've probably already heard of it, maybe you've read it. But in this very easy to read essay that's timeless, what we see is kind of the story of how a pencil evolves. And why it's important is that no one in the world knows how to make a pencil. The other idea that's important in that essay is that these scarce resources have multiple and competing ends. And what that means is the wood that's, kind of chopped down by loggers every day in forests across the country, that wood is dedicated to making a variety of different consumer products. And so entrepreneurs are responding to profit and loss signals to know how many rolls of toilet paper do we need and how many rolls of paper towels do we need versus printer paper, et cetera. But what the crisis does is it kind of overnight changes what people want. So we saw people rushing to the grocery store and they're trying to get toilet paper because we don't know how long the crisis is going to last. They're trying to get other paper products like paper towels. They're also running to get things like bleach and antibacterial wipes and hand sanitizer and things like this. And so, the issue here is really an issue of scarcity, which is that the needs consumers have today, in the beginning of, or almost now we're at mid-May, for hand sanitizer and toilet paper are different than those same consumer needs back in early February. So you need an economic system that allows for adaptability. I think that is another kind of key lesson that I would like us to take away from today, adaptability. Because we can't foresee a crisis. That's really what makes it a crisis. in some cases until it's too late. It's kind of a similar story as a hurricane or a tsunami, a drought, things like this. If you can't predict it, if you don't know it's coming, you can't adequately prepare for it. So I think one of the solutions to the times we find ourselves in right now is entrepreneurship, and you're already seeing it in action. And that's the good news that I want to share with you today, is that entrepreneurship in the United States as well as around the world is stepping into action, and why they're responding to the 3 Ps. Most importantly, they're responding to changes in profitability, right? And changes in prices. So this picture that I have here for you is such a great story, because this is kind of what I call micro entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship can happen with, small individuals that change what they're doing on a daily basis to respond to new needs, or it can be something like Bill Gates and his ventures into trying to find a new vaccine. He's a big entrepreneur, but I think it's important to focus also on the little entrepreneurs. So this is a young woman who lives in Washington, D.C., which is pretty close to where I live. I live in the Washington, D.C. suburbs of Virginia, and she is at Gallaudet University, or she lives near Gallaudet University, and she started a pop-up shop, and this pop-up shop sells hand sanitizers and a variety of different masks. She has some N95 masks, some cloth masks, some disposable masks. And you might ask, well, how was she able to come upon these things when other people can't? You go into Costco and you go into your local grocery store, and regular people can't seem to find these things. So I looked into her story a little bit, and it turns out that her father has a rare form of blood cancer and has had it for some time. And so he's his immune system is very compromised. And so they have to have a lot of hand sanitizer and had N95 masks on hand in case, right? Because every time he goes somewhere, he needs them. And so she decided they could take some of the surplus that they already had for her father and start a pop-up shop. And she even sells little kits, which include a hand sanitizer and a mask, and her prices ranges from, $5 to $20. So I think this is a great story of somebody using resources they already had and redirecting them to the new needs of consumers in a time of what we would call a supply shock. So overnight, when COVID hits us, all of a sudden people realize, I need more bleach than I had, than I needed before. I need more hand sanitizer than I needed before, et cetera. And people in a time of a pandemic like this don't know how long it's going to last, right? So we might buy more hand sanitizer than we did before. And this is kind of not necessarily even hoarding. I'm just saying, maybe you buy 2 bottles instead of 1 bottle because you don't know how long you're going to be in the situation of needing extra hand sanitizer. So that's an example of kind of small level entrepreneurship, somebody that's very nimble, responding to the needs as they come through, and trying to abad, serve. Again, what makes her do this? Well, the opportunity for a profit. I bet that if she started this pop-up shop in, last October, she wouldn't have gotten a lot of business. Why? Because consumer demands and needs were different at that time. So entrepreneurship spurred by creativity is what's going to help us get through this. Now, there's bigger examples of entrepreneurship that I want to talk about with you now as well. And there's just so many examples. You can search the internet all day for this, but I think there's some that are exciting. So the Milken Institute is keeping a live COVID treatment tracker. You can go to their website, it's a massive spreadsheet, and they're just tracking companies that are working on a variety of treatments and vaccines. So the most updated one that I looked at this morning says that there are 133 vaccines in development and 213 different types of treatment. And this pie graph just shows you kind of the different types of treatment. I'm certainly not a medical doctor, so I can't speak very well to the nuances of what's going on in these different sections of this pie graph. But what I would say to you is this is precisely what we need. We need businesses, both large and small. And businesses, remember, are just comprised of ordinary human beings. But what are those businesses seeking right now? You want to be the business that comes up with an antibody test that's effective and fast and cheap. You want to be the business that comes up with antivirals, right? You want to be the business that comes up with the vaccine that's effective and safe. And so we need competition in those sectors. And so how do entrepreneurs, again, how do you go from February when none of these companies were doing this to May where a lot of these companies are doing this? It's the profit and loss and the price signal that's motivating them into action. And I would suggest to you that this profit-seeking action actually has the best possibility to serve the common good. And that's exactly what we need right now. We need entrepreneurs solving our problems. And that's really the problem that economists think about. Economics is about adaptability. Economics is about discovering new and better ways, again, to use our scarce resources in the most productive way possible. Another example of entrepreneurship. And so before I kind of give this, I want to say one thing. Entrepreneurship isn't just always coming up with a new product, right? Like we just talked about vaccines. That's coming up with something new that we haven't had before. Sometimes entrepreneurship is figuring out how to change what you're already doing. So some of you may have gone to yourself to the grocery store, or maybe your parents have gone to the grocery store and reported back to you that there was no toilet paper today, but we're hoping, to go back tomorrow and see toilet paper. And there's really interesting articles that you can read about toilet paper. So one might ask, in a situation where we're dealing with a virus that doesn't have really gastrointestinal effects, why is everybody running around buying toilet paper? And, one answer is people just kind of do what they always do, right? So when it's a snowstorm or things like this, you run out, you get toilet paper and milk, and you go back home. So that could be explaining part of it. But there's something actually much more sophisticated and nuanced going on. And it is that prior to COVID, where we were all on, basically we're all quarantined at home right now, most people spend their days out of the house, whether they're at work, whether they're at school, whether they're at retail establishment. And so most people from the hours of, say, 9 to 5 are using commercial toilet paper. And they're only using residential toilet paper when they're in their homes in the morning and in the evening. Well, obviously, when everybody's on quarantine, or most of the population is on quarantine, now everybody's at home. And so demand for residential toilet paper is up by about 40%. The problem is entrepreneurs, people who make things, Kimberly Clark, who makes Scott tissue is just one example. This is not like snapping your fingers and saying, okay, we're going to go from those big commercial rolls to residential rolls. In fact, it's made from different paper pulp. So it takes, a little bit of time for even entrepreneurs in their own industries to say, oh gosh, we had a 40% change in demand from commercial to residential overnight. And now we have to figure out how to get people residential toilet paper, not because they're hoarding, although some people are probably, but just because demand has gone up because everybody's in their home. And as we start to release quarantine requirements and people go back to work, then demand is going to shift back. Again, I suspect that'll be a little bit more slow. But as you can see, even entrepreneurs in their own industries have things they need to figure out. And we live in a world of scarcity. We don't know how to figure them out. We have to learn. Again, we have to discover. So market economies are about adaptability, right? And so this is why I'm emphasizing today that human creativity that is unleashed by the market process, I think, is the best hope for us to get back to where we were. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a role for charity. It also doesn't mean there's not a role for government to do something. But the big question is, what should government do? And so this next slide I have for you, I really wish I could say that I could take credit for this quote. It's from my friend Anthony Davies. And he said, capitalism looks sometimes what socialism looks like all the time. And these two pictures are of American grocery stores, not Venezuelan grocery stores. What is the difference? If you look at the bottom part of the screen, you see people are scrolling through grocery stores. Again, if you're doing the grocery shopping, you may have experienced this. Maybe your parents have experienced this. But the idea here is that, sometimes you go and there's meat and there's chicken and sometimes there's not. But look at the top picture. Every day, grocery stores get restocked. Maybe not as much as we need. Again, why? Because chicken farmers and toilet paper manufacturers, they have to catch up to our change in demand. But I think the beauty here is that they do catch up. In a socialist economy, if you tried to find a picture of a Venezuelan grocery store today, I can assure you all the shelves are empty. And so people starve. So it's the 3 Ps that make it such that ordinary people like you and I, even in a crisis, can be sure that the chicken will be back in stock, that the hand sanitizer will come. I'm running out of time because I want to make sure I have lots of time for questions, but I just want to share this quick story. This is the grocery store effect, kind of what I call it, is so important that it even kind of changed the life of Boris Yeltsin. So if you haven't studied, Russian history, you may not know who this is, but this is Boris Yeltsin. He was the president of the former Soviet Union after Mikhail Gorbachev. And this is a picture of Boris Yeltsin in an American grocery store in about 1990 in Houston. He went to visit George Bush, who was then the president, and they went to the Johnson Space Center to do a tour. And he said, I would like to go to a grocery store. And this is Boris Yeltsin browsing kind of an ordinary American grocery store on a, Tuesday or something. And he was overwhelmed that the shelves were stocked, that the food waited for the people rather than the people waiting for the food. And I would submit to you that even in a crisis, when Costco doesn't have everything you want as much as you want it, you're very likely assured to go back to Costco and get what you need. We have to wait longer than normal, but the shelves are always restocked. Boris Yeltsin understood this only by visiting the United States, which is an economy that's run on market economies. So I think that this is how we're going to get to flourishing. This is how we're going to restore the supply shocks of COVID. I'm going to skip through this because I want to make sure I have time for questions. But what I want to end on is this idea of burdensome regulations, and I know some of you have questions about this. I think the biggest problem for businesses, and this is a growing problem in the American system, is that there's a lot of onerous, burdensome regulations that make it hard, especially for the small businesses, to operate. And what we're seeing in a time of COVID is actually that many of these burdensome regulations are being rolled back. So you can have telehealth appointments with your doctor, which were not allowed before because of regulations. TSA is allowing you to travel with bigger bottles of hand sanitizer than before. We're rushing vaccines and antiviral and drugs through the FDA that before would take years. By the way, it takes about 25 years for a new drug to go from an idea to the market. We can't wait that long. And so maybe the question I would end on is, if we don't need those regulations in a crisis, do we ever really need them? Because I think these burdensome regulations stop entrepreneurs from responding to the change in supply and change in demand, and they stop entrepreneurs, or they slow down the process of adapting and serving. So I'm gonna stop there, and I would be happy to take any questions that you guys have. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anne. For those of you who are participating in the presentation, you should see a little Q&A icon, either at the bottom of your screen or perhaps at the side of your screen. And I'd like you to type in your questions there rather than using the chat. I'm going to start with a few questions, but I hope that as questions occur to you, that you will enter that Q&A space and list your questions there. So, Anne, I guess my first question is really just to make it more concrete, the 3 Ps that you spoke of, that are the features of a market economy. Can you give us an example of how the 3 Ps might help us recover from COVID, or how entrepreneurs need those? And I know you provided some concrete examples in your talk, but if you could just go over perhaps each one in a little bit more detail right now, so we can really understand those.
The 3 Ps, that is.
Yes.
Yes, sure, and why they're important for entrepreneurship. Absolutely.
And specifically for a period like this.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question, and I think when I was putting together my presentation, I thought, well, these are kind of foundational ideas. Is it important to talk about them? And then I thought through, and I think this is the time where we talk about foundational ideas. So I like that question because these are the basics of how a market economy works. Again, if we distort property rights by distorting the rule of law, then it makes it hard for entrepreneurs to be able to do things. So, for example, you know, and I know somebody, I think Mark Perry is going to be talking about price gouging later, which he's wonderful. So that's going to be a great talk. I don't want to steal his thunder, but this is one of the kind of rules, right? Nobody likes the term price gouging at all. I don't want to be gouged with anything, prices or anything else, right? So price gouging is one of those things that scares us. But what I would say, if we go back to the basics of economics, what are we seeing in a time of COVID? We're seeing that there's a huge change in demand almost overnight. And so what that looks like is everybody wakes up in the morning and they run out to buy the toilet paper and the hand sanitizer and the bleach, and they empty the shelves, right? So what does that do to kind of the longer supply chain? It kind of sends the signal to the entrepreneurs, whoa, what happened? Is this a fluke or is it going to happen again, right? If it's a snowstorm, it's not a fluke. And here's the other thing with snowstorms. Snowstorms are regional. This is happening across the whole country. Everyone's buying more toilet paper. So it's not isolated, right? So that is a huge, huge, huge demand shock. And again, because we live in a world of scarcity and entrepreneurs can't foresee this, they have to react in the moment. How do they react in the moment? Well, if you allow the prices to go up, what that actually signals to consumers is that they should slow their consumption until the entrepreneurs can catch up with supply. And this is the process that we talk about that makes these things work. So if we, don't allow entrepreneurs, for example, to raise prices of toilet paper because it violates some statute on price gouging, then you're actually not allowing the market to work, right? So just because a price goes up in a time of crisis doesn't mean an entrepreneur is trying to gouge you. It just means that demand and supply aren't matched up like they were before. So I think that's a really practical way to think about what entrepreneurs are trying to do, right? And so let's go back to that little pop-up shop. I think that's an example we can get our mind around because we can imagine doing that. I can't imagine coming up with a vaccine, right? I don't know how to think about that, but we can all imagine, okay, I have the masks, I have sanitizer because of my previous situation, and now I want to take that and I want to start a shop. Well, normally you have to apply for a business license and you have to do all these things to set up an established business. And to the extent that we can roll back those regulations, what we're doing is we're freeing people's ability to use their property rights as they see fit. Again, that's the kind of cornerstone of the 3 Ps. And again, for that little entrepreneur, she has to figure out, well, how much do I charge for hand sanitizer, right? She wants to make a profit, but she wants to make sure people are able to buy it. So entrepreneurs actually have a really difficult job of figuring out, especially in a pandemic, how much should I charge? Of course, they'd love to charge, $100 for a 2-ounce bottle. But we want the process of competition to not allow them to do that. So I think that's a really great example. But, these regulations are what I get worried about because I think they interfere with the market's natural ability to jump in and discover. This doesn't mean the market's perfect. So I don't want to be heard as saying that at all. Markets are just made up of people, just like governments are. What's different about a market and a government is that the market is more nimble because it has to be. Again, you have to look kind of at where a price is going, where are profits and losses heading, and I have to respond as quickly as possible. I don't need a bureaucratic committee. I don't need people voting on it. I just do it because I want to make the profit. But the beauty of the market system, because it's voluntary trade, is that we're both better off, right? We're both better off because of those transactions. So I think in COVID, we need that more than ever because we're having all these weird shortages that people couldn't have predicted 3 months ago. Another kind of, this is not an essential thing, but just an example to show you, I have 2 small children and we're expecting that our pools are going to be closed in our neighborhood this summer. So I went online to buy like a little inflatable pool, put in the backyard for them, and they're not all sold out, but there are not a lot of options. On Amazon, when it's slim pickings when you have to pick the third-party sellers, right? So that's what I see even with things like outdoor sprinklers and slip and slides. And why? Because everybody now says, if I can't go to the pool's in my backyard, so everybody rushes to buy it. But there's no way 3 months ago, the makers of slip and slides and pools could have predicted that, right? So they have to kind of adjust as fast as they can.
Well,
I don't know if that was helpful.
Yes, thank you. What about the criticism that people make about entrepreneurs who are out to take advantage of the situation, and not only in the role of higher prices, which you addressed, I think, but, for example, selling hand sanitizer that may be unsafe or ineffective, and somebody washes their hands and then goes to visit a relative thinking that they're not infectious, and the sanitizer they've purchased hasn't been inspected by any government agency. What about that concern?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking about is kind of what is the mechanism that governs the behavior of entrepreneurs in a market economy. And I think what you're saying is especially in a crisis, right? So if I go into my backyard and I start using alcohol to make hand sanitizer and I slap a label on it, we don't really know much about the efficacy. And if I'm trusting that hand sanitizer, you're right. I mean, I could be actually contributing to the spread of COVID and other diseases and viruses for that matter. So, what is the mechanism that regulates the behavior of entrepreneurs such that they don't take advantage of the situation? I would say to us, this is always a concern, not just in a crisis. Maybe it's more of a concern in a crisis. But the only thing that can, well, I shouldn't say the only thing, but I think what the best protection against that is competition, right? We don't want one person making hand sanitizer. We want lots of people making hand sanitizer, because that process of competition is going to force the entrepreneurs to be more transparent, to list their ingredients, all that kind of stuff, right? So this is always a concern in market economies. And I think part of your question is, do we need a government agency to kind of provide, a backstop so that we can certify, this is what it says it is? I think this is so important when we think about vaccines. I mean, I don't really want to inject a vaccine in my body that I don't know what it is. And so maybe part of the problem, and this is part of the critique, is that if we rush these things through the FDA process, we're not going to understand all the unintended consequences and things like this. Again, what I'm encouraged by is that we have 133 vaccines being worked on by I tried to count them all today, but 30, 40, 50 companies. That's the good news. It's not one company, right, working on a vaccine that has no competition. And that's the discipline mechanism in a market. So, I think that we need to be very open and transparent about that. But I am much more willing to rely on that than I am the bureaucratic process of the FDA, which I don't think, I mean, maybe it helps us in the sense that we know we can certify things, but the length of time that it takes costs lives. So you have to weigh the cost of one life versus another life, and you don't want to do that, right? We want to expedite that process as much as we possibly can.
Now, in your work with the Institute for Faith, Work and Economics, you guys talk about work, I think the same way that Northwood thinks about work. It's not just something you do because you want the money you need to get something else. It's something you do for its own sake. And you address this in your opening slide. But now many people are not being allowed to work. They're trying to adapt to new ways of work. I'm just wondering what you have in terms of insight, encouragement, observations about how the world of work is going to change because of this. Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? How can people cope with what they're experiencing right now?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Excuse me. I want to start my answer with where you started in your question, which is I think that the Judeo-Christian understanding of work is so significant and we shouldn't forget it. You are made to work. You're created to work. Work brings you fulfillment. That doesn't mean it's always what you love, right? You don't love every second. As a student, your job is to be a student right now, among other things. But one of your primary jobs is to be a student. And I can assure you that I understand that it's not fun to study for every test and read every book you're assigned, right? Or maybe go to every webinar you're invited to. So some of it is hard, but we're created to work. And it's the way that we cultivate God's creation. And it's the way that we act as stewards of what he's endowed us with. I think that's so important. And that's why we can get fulfillment from things that are hard and difficult and challenging. So we can't give up on that. And you're right. I mean, unemployment filings are at 30 million, 20%. So we're at Great Depression levels of unemployment. And with that comes misery in many ways. So if you can't put food on the table for your family, that's obviously immiserating and discouraging if you don't know when you're going to get back. But it's also discouraging, not the same level of immiserating, to be stuck in your house and working. I would so much rather be in the classroom with my students right now. I would so much rather be at Northwood with you right now. That was my original plan. It's hard to do this. As I said, I have two small children. I mean, they don't work, right? But their job right now is to be students, and they're finding it very difficult to be on Zoom with their teachers. They want to be in the classroom. So this is hard, and part of why it's hard is because we are social creatures, and we're not made to be isolated. And I think that we just have to realize that God is bigger than this, and we need to speak truth all the time, sometimes to power, right? And we need to find our way through this. And I think getting people back to work as safely and as fast as possible is part of the solution. And I think that's going to get us through these dark days where we feel alone and at home. But I say we have to remain hopeful and optimistic. I think the presentation that I gave today, I think, is a presentation of optimism in that, yes, this is a terrible thing, but there's a way out of it. We're going to get out of it. And I think a lot of those people that have been unemployed will go back to work. I think you guys will be back in the classroom with your professors. It might not be as soon as we want, but we'll get there. But how are we going to get there? Human ingenuity is going to figure this out. So I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but I do think it's important to remain hopeful, optimistic, and committed to your work as students, committed to your work as children and parents and all those things that are part of what God created us to be a part of.
Yes, I agree. One of the concerns now is that people who have lost their jobs, some of them are actually making more money now than when they were on the job with government benefits that they're receiving. And I know that it's easy for me to say, get back to work. Work is meaningful and so forth. But a lot of these jobs are tough, and a lot of these jobs are tough to get out of bed for. And do you anticipate perhaps a slow return to work, or maybe even a permanently higher level of joblessness, maybe coming from the supply side?
Just from the supply of labor itself. Yes, I mean, it's very possible. So this is why incentives matter, incentives matter, incentives matter. This is what economists talk about all the time. And so it's not to say that in an unprecedented crisis that we shouldn't do anything to help people with cash that they need because they're unemployed, but you have to be careful, right? Because you want to help, but you also want people to be encouraged to go back to work. So the longer you can remain on unemployment officially and collect more than you do when you work, it's just a natural new response to the new incentive that's been created. So we're personally dealing with this. My husband's in the restaurant industry, and so this is absolutely true. He's worried because we're reopening slowly in about 2 weeks. So some of those restaurants will be opened, and the question is, will he be able to attract people back? And I think at the end of the day, when you've had a job that was taken from you, which is not typically what we see with unemployment, at least en masse, right? You have this job and overnight it's taken away from you. You want to go back to that job. So the hope is that you get not just, even if you're getting more sitting at home, you're not happy sitting at home. And so you want to be back into that social environment. And so, the hope is that that work ethic brings people back because they want to be doing what they were doing before. But I do think we have to be careful about the incentives that these stimulus checks create. On the one hand, you want to help people. On the other hand, you want people to go back to work as soon as they can, and you don't want to discourage that work. Because as you say, that could create longer, lingering unemployment problems. And so putting timelines on when that aid stops is probably going to be really important.
Okay. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that our participants have come up with. I don't know if you can see those on your screen. Can you see those?
I cannot.
All right, I can choose some for you. So one of the questions that came up was whether or not, why I should say, people don't generally think about or appreciate the adaptability function of entrepreneurs and how, I mean, some of the stories you told, uh, they're real tough problems. These problems are getting solved all the time in real time, but we don't see it, we don't appreciate it, and sometimes we even maintain a negative effect because people are motivated by profit. We maintain a negative attitude towards those engaged in these activities. Um, how do you account for the cultural attitude, apathy, or maybe even hostility towards entrepreneurs and business in general?
It's a great question. It's interesting in the United States. We love entrepreneurs. We put on the cover of Time magazine and People magazine and things like this. So in some way, culturally, we love them. We put the big entrepreneurs on magazine covers, right? I don't think we celebrate the small entrepreneurs as much as we should. But I do think there's this weird. Maybe it's not weird. Maybe it's always been there. But as an economist, I find it interesting that we do not like culturally the word profit. We don't want people to make too much profit unless there's somebody like Bill Gates. So Bill Gates has made a lot of profit from his human creativity and ingenuity, which I would argue has made our lives remarkably better. And then he takes a lot of that excess profit he's made through his company and personal fortune, and he invested in development in the developing world and things like this. So we like those kind of entrepreneurs because it's like, well, you make a lot of money, but you do a lot of good with it. Which I think is great, but I think there's a misunderstanding in the first part of the equation. So Bill Gates could not have been that generous without seeking profit in the marketplace first. And I would argue to you that the things he's done through business innovation have made human beings, orders of magnitude better off. And he didn't do that because he's altruistic all the time, right? He wanted to make money. And in the 1970s, he was kind of goofing off in his parents' garage with computers before it was a thing. Now it's a thing partly because of him, but because of him competing against others like Michael Dell and Steve Jobs. So it's, again, that process of competition is what disciplines entrepreneurs. But I think we need to not be worried about profit. I think it's the way we serve. I think we need to be worried about the rules of the game, right? So if you can change the rules of the game to benefit you at the expense of other people, that's where I get really worried. So we call that cronyism or rent seeking in economics. I'm worried about that. And I think we should all be worried about that because those burdensome regulations I talked about before, who do you think establishes those burdensome regulations? People who want to protect themselves from the competition of outsiders. And that is a concern that we should have because I think it protects the rich at the expense of the poor. And that's the exact opposite of what we want. And so I don't think we should be afraid of profit within the context of the rule of law, right? And transparent and property rights and a regime that protects property rights. So a market economy has to sit in that context for it to work like it's supposed to. And then in those cases, I think you're not as worried, about profit. You celebrate it, but we worry about people using the rules and bending the rules to serve their own interests.
You talked a little bit about how government can get out of the way during a crisis and let entrepreneurs do their thing, but can you talk about the role of government from a more positive perspective? What does government bring to the table in order to help entrepreneurs or in order to enable them to do their business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what the state has, and when we're talking about the state in the United States, we're talking about a legitimate government, right? So it has the legitimate power of coercion. That's how we define the state, which means that it can do things that the market can't do. So this is a slippery slope, of course. I've just already talked about one way, slippery slope with regulations, et cetera. So kind of the idea in political theory and political economy is that we need the state for some things, perhaps, but we need to constrain the state because within the bounds of that power to coerce, you have the ability to tell other people what to do, and we want to always limit that. So I think the best thing the government can do is provide an environment in which entrepreneurs and people can wake up in the morning and say, like this woman who had the pop-up shop, this is what I'm going to do today. And I don't need to ask your permission, but rather you're protecting my rights, right? So it's an important transition to think about. The government doesn't provide you with your rights. Your rights are intrinsic to you as a person. The government, at best, can defend your rights and defend the arena for entrepreneurship to be productive. And I think when we lose that, then we start to get into this crony capitalism that people talk about and things like that.
Okay.
I can see some of the questions.
Could you go into a little bit, like, I don't know if you want to get real specific here, but in times of crisis, we have this potential conflict between individual decisions and what might be important from the common good. You know, I'm infectious, but I need to feed my family. I'm going to keep my restaurant open. What is the proper role of government in situations where there might be a potential conflict between individual and common interest problems? I think maybe this gets back into James Buchanan and some of the stuff you were doing at George Mason.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is a conflict, right? To the extent that, think about it this way: if you're, to use your example, if you're a restaurant, the last thing that you want is to be spreading the coronavirus because you're open when you shouldn't be. And to the extent that that could be traced back to you, I think that would be very bad in the long run for your business. And so that's, I think, a good thing. That doesn't mean that people won't try to do it anyway, right? So we're hearing about people getting haircuts and they're not supposed to get haircuts and, you know, all these kind of things. And some states are engaging in much more restrictive kind of stay-at-home shelter-in-place orders than others. But I'm not sure in a market of competition that the tension is as drastic as we think. I mean, I think what the state can do, the best thing that the government has been doing is been allowing these innovations to work, which in some ways means getting out of the way. It's a negative position, right? I'm not saying the government should do X, Y, or Z. I think rather the government should allow businesses to step in and do these things. And what I've noticed is, again, you know, this is anecdotal, but I don't think any profit-seeking restaurant business or hairdresser wants to spread the virus, at least not in a way that can ever be traced back to them. So this makes, to me, the need for tests and antibody tests. We need that rapidly because I think that's going to allow people to get back to work faster too. And, you know, one of the slides that I skipped over, but this is from Hayek, but Buchanan would agree, is, you know, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And so we need to keep that in mind when governors are making these decisions about whose house you can go to and how long you need to, you know, whether you should wear a mask out or whether you shouldn't. You know, we don't know. We're trying to figure it out. And so I think listening to medical professionals is really important right now. And what we're seeing is lots of peer-reviewed scientific articles are coming out. That's really important. So we need research, because that research has to compete against each other. One more thing I would say is that I think the problem with COVID, and I don't think it's going to be particular to COVID, but it's become very politicized, right? So it seems like if you are the person who thinks the economy you should open up kind of soon, you're on the right, and therefore, you know, you don't care. And if I'm oversimplifying. And then if you believe that the governors should just like lock down as long as possible, whatever it takes, then somehow, you know, I don't know, it's just become very politicized. I think that's dangerous. I think we don't know. I think economics is about humility. And I think you have to let people try and test new things. If you look at the Swedish model, right, there's other ways to do this. And maybe allowing people to isolate the vulnerable and allowing people to go back to work is not a crazy idea. So I think we need to allow people who are willing to bear some risk to take some of those risks. At some point we have to. But it's a good question, you know, and I just guess my answer to your question is I don't think there's a set of regulations that's going to know what to do because we haven't found ourselves in this position before, right? At least, you know, in the 1918 flu pandemic, we didn't live in a globalized market economy, so things were a little bit different. We can handle them differently now. So there's surely lessons to be learned, but I think I just worry about completely locking down all entrepreneurs because we think that they only care about profit. They do care about profit, but they also care about not infecting you because they'd like to stay in business, next week and next month, that type of thing.
There's a good question here about creativity and the ways in which, well, I guess the sources of the drivers of creativity. Is it possible that creativity can actually increase as a result of a crisis? Is there any evidence that we're seeing more creativity now than we would have otherwise seen? More enterprise, more solutions that otherwise we would have not. So address that. I know people say sometimes war has this effect as well. We don't want it, but it does seem to energize and motivate and advance and accelerate the rate of technological change. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think I'd be careful about that in the sense that it comes at a great cost, right? So we don't want to use war to kind of innovate new technologies or things like this. I mean, what economists would say is, what are the alternative scenarios in which this innovation would take place? I think the difference here is that 6 months ago, we didn't need this vaccine, right? So there was no entrepreneurship around it because we didn't know we needed it. So that's the problem, is we just don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what the future is going to hold. That said, I think there is a point there that's really valuable, which is that when we allow people to do what God created them to do, which is to be creative, in a time of crisis, they will run to do it. And I think that's a good thing. But I think that creativity gets stifled by an overly burdensome state. And so if there's a lesson to come out of this, it's that I hope these regulations remain rolled back. I'm not overly optimistic that they all will, but I do think that what you're seeing when that happens is that, as you say, people they unleash their creativity when they see a problem, right? They rush to do things. And in a time of crisis, when somebody needs that thing tomorrow, you're going to be on it, right? So there's a sense of urgency, I think, in a crisis that we don't maybe have, normally, but I think creativity is part of the human spirit. I think people are always creative. It's about the incentives and the constraints they face that allows them to, rush into creativity. So it's not that creativity is different now. I just think you're observing a big shift in what people are doing. So other plans that they have are now dormant because you're running to make hand sanitizer, which is a good thing because we need it. But those also represent abandoned projects, right, that people hopefully will get back to when we get back to normal. So there's always a trade-off.
There was a question here that relates to the theology of work, and I guess the question is, well, is all work equally valid, or is there a Christian perspective on different kinds of work? If I could make a profit, for example, selling cigarettes, is that just as good as selling food or medicine, for example? I think the question is getting at, could you elaborate a little bit more about that aspect of the Christian theology of work?
Yeah, I love that question so much. So at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, when I was there, we talked about this a lot. And we talked about it, if you remember the video, and there's this kind of myth of the sacred secular divide, right? So it's like if you're doing something for work that's sacred, like you're a pastor or you're a youth minister or you spend all your days volunteering in a soup kitchen, that's kind of more worthy than being an accountant or something like this. And so we really tried to tackle that head on and say there's no sacred secular divide, because if God made you to do it, then you should do it with integrity and with purpose. So I think that you can be a barista and be serving God's purposes for your life if that's what he's calling you to do. That's, I think, takes a lot of prayerful contemplation and introspection, right? Because we want to do what we want to do, which is the problem. So I think there's that. And I think when you get to that, then I can answer the other part of your question, which if God is probably not going to call you to sell pornography because that is something that is offensive to him. And so, would he ask you or call you to sell it or something? Probably not, right? Cigarettes are a little bit more dicey in some ways, right? Because tobacco can be used to produce lots of other things. Its highest demand, of course, is cigarettes. I'm not so sure. Does God want you smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day? Probably not. But I think these are very personal decisions. But here's another one. I mean, would God want you to own a vineyard? I don't have an objection to that. If you drink 4 bottles of wine a day, that's bad, right? So there's always nuance to these questions, right? So it's like, I think it's very personal. I think it's very personal too. There's obviously things that are off the table, but then there's a lot of things that I think it depends on what God has asked you to do and how he's asking you to serve your community. But there's lots of things. Sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting that you use the example of, you may be called to be a barista. And that's perfectly legitimate if that's where God has placed you. I want to mention, first of all, that, this is not a religious institution or anything like that. So we don't want to exclude anybody with these kind of conversations. But I do think they are important. They represent an important perspective. The barista example was interesting to me in particular because I have a story of my former barista who is now an entrepreneur. He started a business with a 3D print shop, and he came up with a design to split the ventilator so it can serve 2 patients at one time. He can print this at his business. This is the guy that used to serve me my morning coffee. And even though I do think, obviously, that those 2 parts of his life are totally legitimate, and I really appreciated what he did for me, I think perhaps he had the skill, the talent, the motivation. And if you have that, it really would be a shame not to use that. So not everybody has it, but entrepreneurs are kind of a special breed, aren't they? If you have it, then, boy, I sure hope you use it. And I'm grateful that you do.
Yeah, and I think that what we have to, my old boss used to say that everybody is an iceberg and you only get to see what's above the water. And that's the smallest portion. And I will never forget that. There's so much going on in our lives that people don't know anything about. So you could look at that person and say, well, he was a barista for a while, but look what he's doing now, and it's so much more important. But God obviously had him, to be a barista then. So it mattered to him, and it was part of his journey. And so I think that we need to view all work as valid, dignifying, and a way that we cultivate our skills. So when I was in high school, I worked at Baskin-Robbins. I don't still work there. But when I look back on that and I think, gosh, some guy who owned a franchise allowed a 15-year-old, to put my hands in his cash register and make change every night. I touched his inventory, right? He wasn't there. It was a bunch of high school girls running that ice cream shop. And I think that was very significant to my development as a young adult. So there's a time and a place for things. And I think as outsiders, we need to be really careful to judge, that we think, oh, that person shouldn't be doing that. Maybe they shouldn't, but maybe they should. And they probably know better than us.
There have been a number of questions here, which may be difficult to answer at this point, but how has the crisis changed entrepreneurs, small businesses, big businesses? Is the landscape for entrepreneurship going to be different as a result of this crisis? Is there going to be more of these pop-up opportunities that you described? Are those going to become a higher proportion of businesses? Or is it a benefit to the big online delivery type stores? What do you see as the new normal for business enterprise?
I think some of that is unfolding, so I'm not sure I know or am comfortable saying what I predict because I don't know. I love the question about the pop-ups, and this is, like I said, to me this is like micro entrepreneurship. So the hope is that we see more of those because they're local, they're in their communities, and you can look out in your community and say, people need this, I can mobilize, let's do this. So I think you're going to see the way that we do business, though, in general, I think is going to change, especially when you think about physical distancing. I mean, I think that's going to be with us for a while, even if we widen our own personal circles a little bit, which I think will start happening. The way you eat out at a restaurant is going to be different, and the the number of times you're willing to eat out, the way you go to a movie theater. I have no idea how to conceptualize that yet. I fly a lot in normal life. That's going to be very different. And I think the fact that that's going to be different means that there's going to be new entrepreneurial activities. So I read an article the other day, which I hope is wrong, but it said that it's going to take, you have to arrive at the airport 4 hours early is what they're predicting. Now, again, I think it's too early to know, but I do think flying is going to change because you might have to get a test, you might have to go answer questions, who knows how they're going to board us, all that stuff. So if you're waiting around in an airport for 4 hours, whereas before you didn't, there needs to be a lot more stuff in the airport for you to do, right? So entrepreneurs are going to respond to how things shake out. I think to-go delivery, online retail is going to go to all new levels. And I think that's really a great thing. I mean, we have a local mall that's, about 5 miles away. It has not been doing well for years. And I think the reason why is because most people have switched to online shopping or they go to the really big mall, 20 miles away. And I anticipate it. I mean, this is just my projection that it won't open because they were already kind of failing, right? Because so people are going to have different types of shopping experiences and they're going to be virtual and there's going to be different types of delivery. And, so I do think entrepreneurship is going to look different. And what we need right now is creative entrepreneurs to help us figure that out. Big businesses, it's hard to tell what big workspaces are going to look like. Twitter doesn't employ a lot of people, but the CEO of Twitter came out yesterday and said people can work from home forever. I don't know if you saw that article. So, and maybe you can do most of what you need to do at Twitter remotely anyway, but I think that's going to change. The way we do higher ed will change. So a lot is going to change, and entrepreneurs are going to have to be part of being involved in that, and as the rules change, they're going to step in and accommodate. And that's a good thing, right?
Yes. It's always been that way to some extent, isn't it? Maybe,
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we are coming to the end of our scheduled event, and I know there are still more questions here. Perhaps, I don't know if you'd be willing to stay on for a few minutes if there are some questions here that you want to answer. But I would like to thank all of you who have participated in this and remind you that we have more events scheduled, and I'm going to direct you to our website at the Northwood University.edu/Freedom Seminar to look at the entire schedule. And I hope you will join us for some of the remaining events this weekend. If you're taking this course for credit, I'm going to ask you to hang on before you sign out. I have some special instructions for you. And again, I want to thank Dr. Ann Rathbone Bradley for talk here this morning. Thank you.